Hi everyone. The book that I'm going to be reviewing this week is Faith of the Founders, Religion in the New Nation, 1776 to 1826, written by Edwin Gaustad. Gaustad was a professor of history at the University of California, Riverside, and his focus and interest was in religious liberty and the relationship between church and state. Gaustad was born November 14, 1923, and died March 25, 2011, at the age of 87. He lived a remarkable life and was a remarkable religious scholar, writing highly influential works on the religious ideas of the Founding Fathers. Gaustad served in the Army Air Corps during World War II, before going on to earn his bachelor's degree from Baylor University in 1947. He then went on to Brown University, where he studied under historian Edmund S. Morgan, an authority on early American history, covering many topics including Puritanism, the American Revolution, slavery, and notable individuals such as Ben Franklin, and Gaustad received his doctorate degree from there in 1951. Gaustad thought both religion and education were important, but he believed strongly in separation of church and state. He is quoted to have said that religion involves both the heart and the mind, education likewise involves both the heart and mind, but he believed that they should not be put together. In 2002, Gaustad was involved in a highly publicized lawsuit brought by the American Civil Liberties Union, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and other groups against an Alabama judge who refused to remove a monument of the Ten Commandments from the state courthouse. He appeared as an expert witness in the case, and in his testimony invoked Thomas Jefferson, saying that Jefferson had an undying anxiety of anything that would bring church and state together. Jefferson was not against religion, he was against any combination of power with religion. Jefferson is going to be discussed in this book that I'm reviewing today a great deal as well. This book was published by Baylor University Press, which is an academic peer-reviewed press publishing primarily in the field of religion. Baylor University Press was established in 1897 and publishes about 30 new books each year for scholars, students, and intellectually curious general readers. The fact this book was published by an academic peer-reviewed press points to the fact that it was written for purpose of education and will be a reliable source of information. I was assured through researching this publisher that I was going to be reading a well-written, reviewed, and edited scholarly work of history, which was going to be historically accurate. It's not a book that's written for entertainment purposes or mass consumption, which might be less apt to be entirely historically accurate, which instead would be written to sell copies. It's going to be an academic work that I know I can rely on. Also, Baylor University Press is well suited to publish this book because their focus is on the field of religion, which is going to be the focus of this book as well. So it fits well with the publisher. Faith of the Founders is about the development of the relationship between church and state in early American history following the results of the American Revolution. The book documents the various ways that religion is viewed and what role religion would play in the new government. The book covers a time frame from the American Revolution in 1776 to 1826, following how religion and its relationship with the state evolves under the Constitution. There was, of course, an enormous shift religiously as America underwent these major political changes during and after the events of the American Revolution. The colonies went from English territory, where the Anglican faith was tied directly to the English government. In a lot of colonies, the Anglican government was the main government, and a lot of times people had to pay taxes to the church, and because it was tied in with government. Gaustad traces this development of religion and the relationship between church and state, the role religion played in the daily lives of Americans, by looking through the lenses of a number of founders, including Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, Ben Franklin, George Washington, John Adams. And Gaustad discusses a couple of these individuals in each chapter in the way that they played the role in shaping religion in the new nation as it developed after the American Revolution. The thesis that Gaustad presents in his book, Faith of the Founders, is that the development of religion in the United States following the American Revolution was a long, difficult process, but ultimately as the Constitution was established and the First Amendment defined, and the idea of separation of church and state took hold, the lack of a direct relationship and direct ties between religion and government was actually beneficial to faith and religion in the new nation. Gaustad in this book takes us from the beginning of the American Revolution, in which there are direct ties between religion and government, to about a half a century after the Revolution, when the idea of separation of church and state had been established under the Constitution. Gaustad discusses the arrival of many different religious sects and organizations and how different colonies or states had different religious groups. where different religious groups found the most acceptance and popularity. He discusses the relationship between religion and state under the Articles of Confederation, when it was more or less states had the right to decide if they would have an official religion. And he discusses a long process in which a number of different founders, whose words and ideas still hold so much clout today because of their revolutionary actions, and kind of what their views are on religion and the separation of church and state. So it was a long journey, a long road from being an English colony. The Church of England was directly tied to government in a lot of colonies, to, this collection of states as a new nation, to when ultimately, under the Constitution, the First Amendment, when all was said and done, the separation of church and state was established and over time has been defined. And in a lot of ways, which I'll talk about later, it actually benefited religion to have the separation of church and state. In terms of the evidence, the methodology, the majority of sources that Gaustad uses are primary sources, which he uses to tell the story of the development of religion and its relationship between church and state over this 50-year period from 1776 to 1826. He uses writings by people like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Ben Franklin, as well as others, and uses their words as discussion points to discuss the development of religion in this new American nation. This allows the reader to understand religion from the perspective of those founders that played such an important role in the way that it's going to develop in the United States. He also uses examples of correspondence between these individuals, such as letters between Jefferson and Madison, to provide the reader with the thoughts that these individuals had about faith and religion and how they discussed it in their day. I think Gaustad does an excellent job of weaving these primary sources together and using them to create kind of this clear timeline of the different views that individuals had toward religion and how it shaped the future of religious establishment in the United States. He uses the primary sources from the time period and is able to then effectively explain them and use them to make his point clear throughout the book about what he kind of thinks about the path religion takes in the United States after the Revolution. The book is organized into a series of chapters, several of which are geared towards discussing particular founders that played a role in shaping the relationship between church and state. He starts the book with an introduction, which introduces the main themes, and I'll discuss those in just a second. Then gives an overview of the state of religion during the colonial period, which he believes you cannot dismiss when talking about American history, because there's such a long history that took place during the colonial time. Then he focuses on some of those founders and their views towards church and state, which I'll get to in the discussion. And then finally ends with focusing on the eventual relationship that does get established between church and state, and then an epilogue to wrap everything up. So in the introduction, Gaustad, again, he dismisses the idea that the American history during the colonial time period can be kind of forgotten. He makes it clear that you need to discuss that to understand the rest of American history. And he dismisses the idea that American history in the 50 years, 1776 to 1826, was simple and calm. He makes it clear that the years were neither simple nor calm, the paths chosen neither obvious nor inevitable. So during this time, there was no established frame which people could use to answer the questions based on religion. There was no kind of precedent set at that point. So during this half century, there was a lot of disagreement about religion that people needed to work out. And one of the questions, this is where in the introduction he kind of introduces his themes. One of the questions is the idea of the establishment of religion with the state and its role in social order, which most citizens in the Western world at that point believed that there should be some established religion and it should play a role in social order. Many would argue that no state survived without its ecclesiastical alliance, so that in order for a state to survive, it needs some kind of state religion. And no religion deserved to survive that did not work to keep social order. So religion should be working to keep social order as well. One such individual who believed in a state-established religion was John Adams, who believed that establishment of religion in Massachusetts would endure as long as the solar system. So he thinks there should be some state-established religion. But on the flip side of that, there are dissenters who are going to believe that religion had much more to do with the human heart than the councils of state, meaning that religion is not something that is just based on being connected with the state, connected with government. This voice of dissent was at first a minority one, but the Great Awakening that comes along does move it kind of into the public forum and does bring this kind of debate to the forefront of church versus state and that separation. Another perspective he's going to discuss is that of religious liberty, and the idea that originally there were 13 separate colonies, which all had kind of their own different opinions as to how you handle religion. And that's going to come down, a lot of his discussion on that will be about Jefferson and Madison and their views of what religion should have been in terms of church and state. He also discusses the idea of religion and national unity and how Americans question whether a new nation could be unified without a nationally established church. And he's going to discuss how they do unify when he discusses Benjamin Franklin and George Washington and their kind of icon status. And then Gaustad also discusses religion and reason and the fact that some, including Jefferson, argued that Americans had within their grasp the opportunity for a purification of Christianity, but others argued that Christianity didn't need purification or reform, but rather needed to be affirmed, so that we should, again, have that connection of an official religion that needed to affirm the fact that with this new nation, God created us and not we created ourselves. So again, that idea of social order. And then ultimately he discusses how removing governmental support at the end of this book, he'll discuss this, and sanction from religion is actually going to benefit religion in the new nation. And again, I'll get to that later on as well. Chapter 2, titled The Colonies and Their Churches, and Gaustad in this chapter discusses the status of religion during the colonial period in America, discusses in this chapter the fact that religion was a vital part of society in colonial America, even though each colony did have its own views, because it was just kind of separate, very different colonies that just happened to be connected. So he discusses a couple early examples of individuals in this chapter as well who did believe in separation of church and state and religious liberty, religious toleration, because in many of the colonies there was a strong connection between the state and religion, whether it be the Church of England or, in, for example, New England, Congregationalists, Puritans. There was a lot of connection between church and state, and there were some American people who did not think that this should be happening, that there was a need for religious freedom and religious toleration. And a couple of those people he talks about are Roger Williams, who established the colony of Rhode Island, to be very different from states like Connecticut, Massachusetts, where there was this tie between church and state. And an interesting piece that was in this chapter, an interesting kind of story that I found to be particularly of interest is for Williams, when he was making his decision about his colony, Rhode Island, it stemmed from something that took place when an uneducated and powerless Baptist named Obadiah Holmes left Rhode Island in 1651 on a private preaching mission to Massachusetts, where he was then arrested, tried, convicted, and publicly whipped in Boston with 30 lashes, which Williams believed was completely wrong, that no one should face religious persecution like that. So he really worked to make Rhode Island a colony of religious freedom, religious tolerance. And another example discussed was William Penn, who was also an early fighter for religious freedom, religious toleration, when he established Pennsylvania and said that no person shall be compelled at any time to frequent or maintain any religious worship place or ministry whatever. So that, again, everyone should have religious freedom, religious toleration in this colony. Okay. In Chapter 3, Gaustad discusses two founders, Jefferson and Madison, who really believed in religious liberty, religious freedom, similarly to Williams and Penn. Jefferson was convinced religious liberty must be built into the structural frame of the new government of his state of Virginia, and he proposed the following, which is a quote: "All persons shall have full and free liberty of religious opinion, nor shall any be compelled to frequent or maintain any religious institution." So, in other words, Jefferson wanted freedom for religion and freedom from religion. And likewise, Madison also argued that religion is never properly a matter for armies to decide or legislators to promote. So, again, that it's not something that's up to the government, to the state, to choose with regards to religion. Jefferson argued that religion had historically been a major means for shackling human minds, not for emancipating them. He believed that if people were being forced into a particular religion, that there was no true civil liberty. However, when delegates met at the Constitutional Convention, their preference seemed to be to leave religion to the states, and they only took two kind of modest steps with respect to religion with the goal of avoiding problems. They agreed that there would be no religious tests for federal office holders to be required, and they said one could affirm rather than swear in taking the oath of office. But other than that, the Constitution was silent on religion. However, over time, with obviously we have the First Amendment that points to religious liberty, and founders like Madison and Jefferson, who believed in freedom of religion, separation of church and state, practice religious liberty. So Jefferson, when he was president, for example, denied a request from a Baptist group to set aside a day of fasting because of the religious overtones. Madison vetoed a bill that would have provided federal lands to a Baptist church in the Mississippi Territory, again, because he felt like it was favoring religion over one religion over another. So they show their commitment to religious freedom as president, and over time, this kind of standard gets established. Chapter 4, Gaustad discusses Franklin and Washington as being, American icons. So following the American Revolution, Americans were looking for someone or something to look towards, because now it wasn't anymore loyalty to England, it wasn't the monarchy, because they were now an independent nation. There's also no national church to look to. So as a result, Americans looked to two what Gaustad calls national heroes in Benjamin Franklin and George Washington. They pretty much, in terms of religion, only kind of discussed in general terms. They did make it clear that they believed in one God, one creator of the universe, but they didn't really elaborate on their religious. But interestingly, no one really ever pushed them to. Kind of the importance of these guys, though, is that when there was all this uncertainty going on, these questions about the new nation, complex religious beliefs, no real guide at the center of, for the American people, Franklin and Washington served as kind of almost like religious figures themselves for the people to look to. They were seen as being wise, almost like biblical figures like Moses, who were supposed to lead the nation forward. So they almost served in place of a national religion to try to bring people together and unify the American people during this time of kind of uncertainty. Chapter 5 focused on John Adams and Thomas Jefferson as philosophers in the Age of Reason. Adams believed in the idea that human authority must never impede the investigative right of every individual to seek truth, to discover truth, to proclaim truth. And that is a quote from Adams. He didn't like the fact that everyone, all these different religions, kind of wanted a so-called monopoly on immortality. He preferred honesty, not hypocrisy. He didn't, think one religion should own immortality over, another one. That kind of everyone was entitled to their own beliefs, their own thoughts. He denounced the priestcraft and corrupted revelation that had changed a pure gospel of Jesus into a crafty combination of superstition, knavery, and hypocrisy. He thought kind of people were corrupting the pure religion, pure religious beliefs. And he was also suspicious of religious awakenings, religious enthusiasm. He believed in kind of a pure gospel, so to speak. And Jefferson also said kind of the same thing, even though he was very much for religious freedom, religious liberty. He stated he was not anti-Christian, only anti-corruption. So, like Adams, didn't want people corrupting religious beliefs. And again, is where they felt like if the government was going to be involved, people were going to be involved with religion, telling people what to do religiously, that's where that corruption would come from. That there needed to be a lack of this corruption. And finally, in Chapter 6, Gaustad discusses how once the Constitutional Convention came to an end, the Constitution was ratified, and discussions kind of started to happen with religion, religious liberty, and that eventually, over time, once the First Amendment, the Constitution, everything was ratified, that you see this finally separation of church and state. And interestingly, many people were surprised that the elimination of government support and public taxation for religion didn't prove to be catastrophic. It actually kind of helped religions, helped faith, and brought new life to religious beliefs. It was now not up to government. It was up to the people to work for their religious beliefs. It was voluntary, not by political force. This brings a new energy to the people in terms of religion and working for religious freedom. So this separation of church and state, which many people thought would be detrimental to religion, actually ends up being helpful and kind of leads to a revival in religion. It also helped to remove much of the corruption from religion that were being discussed by people like Adams and Jefferson by removing the governmental ties. And then Gaustad just wraps it up with a brief epilogue, which I think can be summed up pretty well when he says that the Founding Fathers had not brought the Second Great Awakening, but that it was left then, as now, to the people who determine what free and unfettered minds should do, especially in the realm of religion. So basically that the Second Great Awakening of religion was brought about by removing government, removing political ties, and instead letting it be the people who determined what they were going to do. Which I think is kind of a really interesting point that I had never really thought of in terms of the impact separation of church and state would have. In terms of the historical relevance, the book is relevant in that it focuses on one aspect of society during the post-revolutionary phase, being religion and its place in the society of the new nation. It's similar to a lot of the other books we've read in that it deals with one particular aspect of society. For example, when we read about slavery a couple of weeks ago, this provides a better understanding of what life was like in America following the revolution and what daily life was like in America. And it's just as important that we look at all aspects of society, such as just religion as an example, to get a full understanding of the establishment of the new nation. He doesn't engage that much with other historians, other authors, because his focus is mostly on primary sources, but his place as a lead scholar on religious aspects of early American history give us kind of an idea that this is a key work in terms of understanding how America developed and how religion in America developed over time, and still is a key today in terms of separation of church and state. I did enjoy reading this book, and I liked the way that it was broken down by the views of important founders of American history and what their views were on religion, religious beliefs. I thought it was kind of an effective way to look at this discussion, so I really did enjoy that. The only criticism I kind of had as I'm reading this was I was thinking back to the book I read, Slavery and the Founders by Finkelman, and he mentioned how many scholars kind of overlook the negatives of the founders because of what they did for the nation. And I kind of got that sense as I'm reading this, even though obviously this is a different situation because it's about religion, and that's the focus that he stayed with throughout the book. But I do feel like it really kind of idolized almost these founders and kind of overlooked some of the flaws that they might have had. But otherwise, I really did enjoy reading it. Thought it was quite interesting look at religion in the new nation, and I look forward to you guys' discussion this week. Thanks.